June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll, a lonely coral strip adrift in the endless Pacific. At 10 a.m., the sea was calm, almost deceptively calm. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and oil. Engines rumbled somewhere over the horizon, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat beneath the sky. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky leaned over the edge of the cockpit canopy, scanning the empty ocean below. His fuel was running low. His squadron was scattered. And yet, beyond that pale horizon, history was waiting to be found. The world had changed in just 6 months. Since the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the Pacific had become a sea of loss, a graveyard of ships, pilots, and pride. Japan's navy moved like a storm, swift, precise, devastating. They had struck Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, an empire expanding with mechanical certainty. But for the United States, recovery had already begun. In the shipyards of California, the clang of hammers echoed day and night. On airfields in Kansas and Rhode Island, new aircraft rolled off the lines, the SBD Dauntless, the Wildcat, the Avenger. America was rebuilding its arsenal, and its confidence, piece by piece. Yet victory was still a distant word. Intelligence officers in Hawaii had begun to pick apart Japan's radio codes, fragments of messages, scraps of intent. Through the patient work of men at Station Haipo, one clue emerged. The enemy was planning something around a place known only as AF. Commander Joseph Rochefort, a cryptologist with more cigarettes than sleep, suspected AF meant Midway. He was right. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, calm and calculating, made the bold choice to trust that guess. He moved his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, to ambush the Japanese strike force. The plan was daring. The odds were not in his favor. Japan's fleet was larger, faster, and led by the men who had mastered Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. For Japan, Midway was meant to be the finishing blow, a trap to destroy what remained of the American carriers, giving Tokyo total control of the Pacific. For America, it was a desperate gamble to stop the storm before it reached the West Coast. And so, on the dawn of June the 4th, 2 fleets, unseen by each other, began to move toward destiny. On Midway Atoll itself, the first light of day broke over the water, glinting off coral and sandbags. Marine gunners checked their anti-aircraft guns, their breath catching in the early wind. Pilots of Marine Fighter Squadron 221 prepared to meet an enemy they couldn't see yet. The air was heavy, the kind of silence before thunder. At 6:20 a.m., the first Japanese planes appeared, dozens of Aichi dive bombers escorted by Zero fighters. They came out of the sun, engines howling, diving through clouds of flak. Bombs shattered the runways, tore through hangars, and turned coral dust into smoke. The island burned. On the American carriers far to the east, reports came in through static and panic. Midway under attack. The hunt for the Japanese fleet had begun. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky was leading Enterprise's Scouting Squadron 6, the Bombing 6, as they called themselves. He was 32 years old, quiet, methodical, a man who believed precision was a virtue even in chaos. He had flown through bad weather, navigated by instinct, and now he was tasked with finding the enemy's carriers in an ocean that could swallow whole fleets. The Dauntless dive bomber was a simple machine. Steel frame, 2-man crew, a single bomb under the fuselage. It could climb to 20,000 feet and dive almost vertically toward its target. It was not fast, not glamorous, but it was steady, and in McClusky's hands, deadly accurate. By mid-morning, tension hung in the cockpits like fog. McClusky's fuel gauge dipped lower with each minute. His pilots scanned the horizon, nothing but endless blue. Below them, the Pacific stretched like glass. They had been searching for over 2 hours. Every man knew the truth they didn't speak aloud. If they didn't find the Japanese soon, they'd have to ditch into the ocean and hope to be rescued if they were lucky. But McClusky refused to turn back. He believed the enemy had to be near. Logic, experience, and intuition all pointed to one direction. At 10:20 a.m., he saw it, a faint, thin trail of oil on the surface of the sea. It looked like nothing, and yet it was everything. A Japanese destroyer, Arashi, racing north at full speed. McClusky followed it. The destroyer's wake pointed like an arrow toward the rest of the fleet. He banked his dauntless northeast and signaled his men to follow. 18 planes turned together, sunlight flashing off their wings. 10 minutes later, the clouds broke, and below them the sea erupted into sight. 4 massive Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay spread across the water in a perfect diamond formation. Decks crowded with aircraft being refueled, rearmed, and prepared for a second strike on Midway. It was the most vulnerable moment in naval warfare. Planes fueled, bombs exposed, and decks crowded. McClusky had found them at the single instant when the entire Japanese offensive hung by a thread. Had he turned back 5 minutes earlier, he would have missed them. Had he found them 10 minutes sooner, their decks would have been empty, their aircraft already airborne. But fate and instinct had brought him to the right place at the right time. Below him, 4 symbols of Japan's naval supremacy floated in formation. Above, the men of Enterprise and Yorktown prepared to dive, and in that suspended moment, between discovery and destruction, the Pacific held its breath. The storm had been found. Now it would break. War often turns not on plans, but on moments. The quiet decisions made by men who refuse to surrender to uncertainty. For Wade McClusky, that moment had arrived over the vast blue silence of the Pacific, when instinct became destiny, and the hunter finally saw his prey. The silence before the storm was ending. The morning of June 4th unfolded like a machine running out of time. Every decision, every minute, would decide who ruled the Pacific. At 10:24 a.m., Wade McClusky found his target, but what came next would test not only the men who fought, but the very limits of human endurance. Hours before McClusky's discovery, the battle had already begun in chaos. From the American carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, waves of torpedo bombers had launched at dawn, low, slow, and terribly vulnerable. They flew without fighter cover, driven by duty and desperation. They never came back. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had charged straight into the heart of the Japanese formation. 30 pilots and crewmen, 29 never returned. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, who drifted alone in the sea, watching as history unfolded above him. Their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level. It left the skies open, high above, for McClusky's dive bombers. Fate, once cruel, had shifted. The Japanese fleet was moving north fast. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was caught between 2 competing orders. His first wave had already bombed Midway, but the island was not destroyed. He wanted to strike again. Yet intelligence from his scouts hinted that American carriers were nearby. His decks were chaos, bombs being loaded, then unloaded, then reloaded again. Fuel lines ran across the steel like veins waiting to ignite. The Japanese carrier force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was powerful, but in that moment it was exposed. Nagumo hesitated for just 10 minutes, and 10 minutes in war can last forever. At 10:24 a.m., McClusky's dauntless dive bombers broke through the clouds. They descended out of the sun, the same tactic the Japanese had used at Pearl Harbor. The sky came alive with tracer fire and twisting contrails. McClusky's group split. Some dove on Kaga, others on Akagi. The wind screamed through the canopies as the bombers tipped forward into their dives, near vertical, engines shrieking. Below them, Japanese deck crews froze, realizing too late what was coming. The first bomb from Enterprise's Bombing Squadron 6 struck Kaga's flight deck near the midsection. Then another, and another. In seconds, fire rolled across the hangar decks, igniting torpedoes and fuel lines. Men ran through smoke and flame, disciplined even as death swept over them. On Akagi, McClusky released his bomb at 1,500 feet, a single hit that pierced through the flight deck and detonated among torpedoes waiting below. The ship convulsed. The air filled with fire, fragments, and screams drowned by the roar of burning aviation fuel. From miles away, observers on the Enterprise saw columns of black smoke climbing into the sky, the symbols of Japan's might, now burning. Admiral Raymond Spruance, calm as ever, simply said, "Gentlemen, that's Midway." By 10:30, 2 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded. A third Soryu was hit minutes later by planes from the Yorktown. Within 20 minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were ablaze, each a city of fire, drifting helplessly in the sea. The temperature inside their hangar decks reached over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Ammunition cooked off in steady bursts like metal rain. Men jumped into the sea to escape the inferno, only to be caught in waves of burning oil. Even in agony, many refused to abandon ship, clinging to the rails, saluting their flag as the ocean consumed their decks. For the first time in the war, Japan's illusion of invincibility cracked. The pilots who had trained for years, the elite corps of the Imperial Navy, were gone in a single morning. They could not be replaced. Their loss was not only military but spiritual, a wound that bled through Japan's confidence for the rest of the war. On the American side, disbelief gave way to relief, and then to exhaustion. McClusky's men were running out of fuel. Their radios were crackling with fragments of victory reports and distress calls. One by one, the dauntless bombers turned for home, engines coughing, some never making it back to the carriers. But for now, in that small window of time between sky and sea, they had changed the world. The Pacific, once lost, now had a heartbeat again. The reports reached Admiral Nimitz by encrypted radio at Pearl Harbor. 3 enemy carriers burning. He stood silent for a long time, then looked up from the message. He didn't celebrate. He simply said it was close, very close, because victory in war is never clean. It is built on luck, sacrifice, and timing, and every victory leaves a shadow behind. At Midway, that shadow was the ocean itself, littered with debris, fuel, and the drifting bodies of men from both sides. As the morning ended, smoke blanketed the Pacific horizon. Ships burned, planes limped home, and somewhere beneath the waves, history shifted its weight. The breaking point had come and gone, a single hour that decided the fate of thousands and the future of nations. McClusky had done what he came to do, but the battle was not over. Japan still had 1 carrier left, Hiryu, and she was not done fighting. The storm had broken, but the long night was only beginning. The morning sky above Midway was no longer blue. It burned, streaked with smoke, shrapnel, and the drifting shadows of dying planes. By noon, 3 of Japan's proudest carriers were aflame, but one still lived, and she was ready to strike back. The carrier Hiryu, the youngest of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers, survived McClusky's assault untouched. Her decks were blackened with smoke from distant fires, but her heart still beat strong. Her commander, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, a man of fierce loyalty and unbending discipline, refused to retreat. He gathered what remained of his strike groups. Only a handful of planes were left, but he would use them all. "Prepare for launch," he said simply. The words carried through the intercom, through every deck, through every surviving crewman who still had the strength to move. Even as the sea around them glowed red with reflected fire, they obeyed. At 12:20 p.m., Hiryu's first wave of Val dive bombers took off, escorted by Zero fighters. Their target, the carrier Yorktown. The Americans had just begun to think the worst was over, refueling planes, repairing decks, and clearing casualties. Then came the lookout's cry, "Enemy aircraft inbound. Bearing 340, altitude 8,000. General quarters, sirens, men running across the flight deck, hauling ammunition, manning anti-aircraft guns. The sky above the Yorktown filled with black puffs of flak. The ship shuddered under its own gunfire, her crew firing blind into the sun. Through that wall of fire came the Val dive bombers, sleek, determined, falling like daggers. One after another they plunged from 12,000 feet, bombs whistling, engines screaming. At 12:30 the first bomb struck Yorktown near her island. The deck lifted, plates buckled, and smoke engulfed the bridge. A second bomb tore through the forward elevator. Men were thrown like rag dolls against steel bulkheads. Within minutes, Yorktown's engine stopped. She drifted dead in the water, but her crew refused to abandon her. Damage control parties fought through smoke and flame, sealing bulkheads, jettisoning planes, turning hoses on walls of fire. They fought the ship itself, determined to keep her alive. By 2 p.m., the flames were under control. The ship was wounded but still afloat. The men cheered, a fragile, fleeting cheer carried over blackened steel. But Hiryu was not finished. Her second strike group, torpedo planes this time, was already on its way. At 2:40 p.m., the Yorktown's radar picked up the second wave. Enemy aircraft bearing 3 on 10, distance 36 miles. The ship turned into the wind. Fighter cover rose to intercept, but the Zeros were waiting. The torpedo bombers came in low, their wings slicing through sea spray. Anti-aircraft fire raked the sky, but the enemy pressed on, steady and silent. 2 torpedoes hit home, one to starboard, one to port. Yorktown lurched violently, rolled, and began to list. Power flickered out. The order came at last. Abandon ship. Men climbed down ropes into oil-slicked water, clinging to debris, their faces black with soot. They had fought the ship back to life, and now they were watching her die. Even then, many looked back toward the carrier, as though she might rise again. On Hiryu's bridge, Admiral Yamaguchi watched smoke rising from the horizon. He believed Yorktown was finished. In his mind, he had avenged his fallen comrades. But fate had one final turn left to play. American scout planes had spotted the Hiryu. At 3:30 p.m., dive bombers from the Enterprise, survivors of McClusky's earlier strike, turned their sights toward the last Japanese carrier still afloat. The approach was silent. The sky, once alive with gunfire, now seemed eerily calm, just the distant echo of engines and the soft hiss of wind through the canopies. At 5:08 p.m., the Dauntlesses rolled into their dives. They fell through smoke and cloud, one after another, like hawks striking from the sun. 3 direct hits, one near the bridge, one through the flight deck, and one deep into the hangar bay. Hiryu erupted. Flames roared from bow to stern. Her crew fought with buckets, pumps, and bare hands, but the inferno was unstoppable. At 5:42 p.m., Yamaguchi made his decision. He would not abandon ship. He gathered his men, bowed toward the Emperor's flag, and said quietly, I will go down with Hiryu. Those who wish to fight another day, leave now. Most stayed. As the sun fell over the Pacific, Hiryu burned alone, the last light of the Japanese strike force flickering into the sea. The ocean was still again, broken only by the sound of distant explosions and the crackle of fire on water. By nightfall, the balance of the Pacific had shifted. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. Japan's naval air arm, its elite pilots and crews, had been shattered. The losses were irreplaceable, not just in machines, but in experience, in belief. For the Americans, the victory came at a cost they could feel in their bones. Dozens of planes lost, hundreds of men gone, and one of their own carriers crippled. The air smelled of oil and grief. Men spoke in whispers or not at all. In the dark that night, McClusky sat on the deck of the Enterprise, listening to the waves slap against the hull. He had seen his men dive through clouds of fire, had watched them not return. He knew victory did not erase the faces of those lost. It only made them quieter. War, he realized, was not about winning or losing. It was about surviving the moment when everything burns and somehow finding meaning in what remains. The ocean around Midway glowed faintly in the dark, the embers of ships, the reflections of a battle that had changed history. The fire was dying, but its light would never go out. The fires of battle faded, but the echoes remained. Smoke drifted across the Pacific like a funeral shroud, and the ocean, once a mirror of sunlight, now reflected only ruin. It was evening, June 4th, 1942. The waves rolled gently, carrying pieces of history, twisted steel, broken wings, and the last unspoken words of men who had fallen. Midway had been won, but the cost hung heavy in the air. On the decks of the Enterprise and Hornet, exhausted crews worked through the night. Fuel hoses hissed, stretchers passed hand to hand, the smell of burnt aviation fuel clung to every surface. Men spoke in fragments, their voices hoarse from smoke and fear. Some stared out over the railing, watching the distant glow where Japanese carriers had burned. McClusky walked among them, his flight suit still streaked with oil. He had not slept in nearly 2 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. The dive, the twisting plumes of flak, the flash of the Akagi's explosion. He could still hear the radio crackle, the last words of pilots who never made it home. "Earl, Tom." "You did it," he whispered into the wind. The ocean answered only with silence. By dawn on June 5th, the American fleet turned east, regrouping, tending to the wounded. Yorktown still floated, scarred but alive. Her crew, refusing to surrender her, returned with repair ships, hoping to save her from the depths. For a moment it seemed she might yet survive. But Japan was not done. Even in defeat, Admiral Yamamoto sought revenge. He ordered submarines to shadow the retreating fleet. And on June 6th, the submarine I-168 found her prey. In the early light, a torpedo struck Yorktown's side. A final brutal blow. The sea rushed in, swallowing compartments, flooding lower decks. Her list deepened, the deck tilted, and once again the order came. Abandon ship. Men leapt into the sea for the second time in 3 days. They watched as their carrier, the ship that had carried them through Coral Sea and now Midway, slowly rolled onto her side. At 7:01 a.m., Yorktown slipped beneath the surface, her flag still flying. For those who survived, it felt like watching a friend die. A living thing that had protected them, now gone to the deep. On the Japanese side, the realization of defeat spread like a shadow. Messages from Hiryu ceased. Reconnaissance planes failed to return. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy waited for news that would never come. When the truth arrived, that 4 of their carriers, their best aviators and their air crews, were lost, shock rippled through the command. Japan had built its naval power on precision and pride, an unbroken belief in the invincibility of its fleet. But Midway shattered that illusion. Those lost were not just ships. They were generations of experience. Pilots who had trained since childhood, who had fought from China to Pearl Harbor, gone in a single day. In one of his private reflections, Admiral Yamamoto would later write, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He knew, perhaps better than anyone, what Midway truly meant. Japan could still fight and would, but the balance had tipped. The Empire's long reach had been broken at its center. Meanwhile, on Midway Island itself, the defenders finally exhaled. Marines, mechanics, and signalmen looked up at a sky that was at last empty. Their bunkers were littered with shell casings, their runways cratered, but they had held. Some wept openly. Others simply sat down in the sand, staring at the sea, not yet believing they had survived. One Marine wrote in his diary that night, "We watched the horizon burn, and for the first time I thought, maybe we'll see home again." For McClusky and his men, home still felt far away. But in that silence, something changed. The war that had begun with surprise and humiliation at Pearl Harbor had turned. America had found its footing, and the tide of the Pacific began to shift. Victory, however, is never clean. For every burning carrier, there were faces, names etched into the sea. Fathers, sons, brothers, whose courage was spent in minutes, whose stories would fade beneath the waves. Midway was not a triumph of destruction, but of endurance, of those who refused to yield when the world seemed to collapse around them. McClusky would later say little of his role. He returned home a hero, but never called himself one. In his letters, he spoke more often of the men who didn't return, those who dived and never climbed again. In the quiet of his cabin one evening, he wrote, "We found them not because we were clever, but because we refused to give up. And when we found them, history changed. The Pacific, vast and blue once more, swallowed the last traces of war. But beneath that calm surface lies the memory of June 1942, a day when courage collided with fate and the course of the Second World War bent in a new direction. The fall of the Japanese carriers was not just a loss of ships. It was the fall of a dream of dominance, silenced by the sound of American engines and the fire of relentless resolve." And as the stars rose over the Pacific that night, the world itself was already changing. The guns were silent, the smoke had drifted away, but for those who lived through Midway, the war was far from over. In the stillness that followed, the Pacific seemed endless again. Calm waves rolled over the wreckage of ships that only days before had changed history. Beneath them lay steel tombs, the resting places of hundreds of men from both sides. The ocean, indifferent as ever, kept their secrets. Aboard the Enterprise, the decks that once thundered with engines now echoed with the slow rhythm of boots and stretchers. Wounded pilots, bandaged and burned, whispered the same question again and again, "Did we win?" And every officer, every medic, every friend answered the same way, with a silent nod. They had won, but it didn't feel like victory. The hangar decks were filled with the smell of oil, blood, and salt. Crews worked through the night, cleaning wreckage, gathering fragments of aircraft that would never fly again. On the walls of the ready room, someone had written the names of those lost in chalk. By morning, the list stretched from floor to ceiling. Each name was a story, a laugh remembered, a letter never sent, a voice that now lived only in memory. Midway was more than a battle. It was the hinge of the Pacific War, the moment when Japan's advance finally broke. 4 of its frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, gone. Over 300 aircraft destroyed, more than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen lost. Among them, some of the finest pilots in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, men Japan could never replace. The United States, by contrast, had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and 3 to 7 men. But what it gained was something greater, momentum. For the first time, America could see the possibility of victory. And in every command room from Pearl Harbor to Washington, the message was clear. Japan could be beaten. But for those who had fought, the statistics meant little. War is never lived in numbers, only in moments. The sound of a friend's last transmission, the shockwave that tears through metal, the silence that follows when a voice disappears from the radio. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky carried those moments with him. He returned home a hero, awarded the Navy Cross for his leadership and courage. But he rarely spoke about Midway. In letters to his wife, Ruth, he wrote not of glory, but of ghosts. "The sea is too wide," he once wrote. "It keeps too many men." He understood what few did, that courage and tragedy often share the same sky. The men who survived went on to fight again, in the Solomon Islands, in the Marshalls, at the Philippine Sea. Many of them would never return, but Midway became their lodestar, a symbol of endurance and hope in the darkest hours of the Pacific War. For Japan, the loss was not just military, it was spiritual. The Imperial Navy, once the sharpest blade in the Pacific, now faced a wound it could not heal. Shipyards could build new carriers, but the men who flew and fought, the irreplaceable air crews who had trained for years, were gone. Each battle afterward would drain the empire further until, at last, there was nothing left to give. From that point on, Japan would fight a defensive war, one measured not in victories but in sacrifices. Back home, across America, telegrams began to arrive. Each one began the same way. The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you. Mothers wept behind closed doors. Wives clutched photographs, reading the same line over and over. Children would grow up with stories instead of fathers. Such was the quiet inheritance of victory. In the years after the war, historians would study Midway's tactics, the cryptanalysis that found the Japanese fleet, the decisions of Admirals Nimitz and Spruance, the timing that seemed almost divine. They would call it the most stunning and decisive blow in naval warfare. But those who had been there spoke of something simpler: luck, instinct, and faith in one another. One mechanic decades later said, "It wasn't just courage. It was every man doing his job even when he thought he wouldn't see the sun set." That's what won the battle. Not technology, not numbers, but endurance. In the final months of 1942, McClusky's dauntless squadron was disbanded. New aircraft, new pilots, new wars followed. But the memory of Midway lingered, like the faint echo of engines across an empty ocean. In time, even the ships themselves would vanish. The Yorktown, the Kaga, the Akagi, all would rest beneath thousands of feet of water. And there, in the still darkness of the Pacific, they remain, monuments not of victory or defeat, but of human will. Divers who have visited them describe the same thing: the eerie stillness, the helmets resting on decks, the instruments frozen in time, a battlefield turned into a graveyard, a moment of history perfectly preserved by silence. The men of Midway are gone now, but in the hum of every modern aircraft, in the silence of every ocean dawn, their story still lives. Because what they did was more than win a battle. They proved that courage can change the course of history, even when it comes at a terrible cost. And somewhere in that vast Pacific night, if you listen long enough, you can almost hear them still, engines in the distance, a heartbeat in the sky, a whisper of what they left behind. The long night of Midway was not just an ending. It was the beginning of a new world, one rebuilt on sacrifice, courage, and remembrance. And when dawn came again, it carried the promise that what they had done and what they had lost would never be forgotten. Years passed. The Pacific grew silent again. But beneath its calm surface, the ghosts of Midway still waited. Time has a way of softening memory, but not for the men who lived it. For them, the roar of engines and the flash of explosions never truly faded. Even in peace, they carried the echoes with them, in dreams, in silence, in the spaces between words. After the war ended in 1945, America entered an age of rebuilding. Factories shifted from producing weapons to automobiles, and soldiers returned to cities that seemed too quiet. But for the veterans of Midway, normal life was never quite normal again. Some returned to farms, others to schools or offices. But in the quiet hours, in the sound of wind against a window, or the smell of oil and salt, the memories came back. For Wade McClusky, they came often. He would later tell a friend that every time he heard a plane engine overhead, he still looked up, half expecting to see Japanese Zeros diving from the sun. He was not alone. Across the nation, tens of thousands of veterans carried similar memories, pieces of the Pacific locked inside them. And in Japan, survivors bore their own burdens. Men who had once served aboard Akagi or Kaga spent the rest of their lives haunted by the sight of burning decks and the cries of their comrades. One Japanese sailor later wrote in his memoir, "The ocean that day was a mirror of hell. We believed our gods had turned away." He would never again speak of war without tears. In the years that followed, the full story of Midway remained hidden behind secrecy. American code-breaking, the silent triumph that had made the victory possible, was classified. Even many pilots who fought in the battle never knew that their success had begun weeks earlier, in a small, windowless room at Pearl Harbor. There, a group of cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had deciphered Japan's radio codes, discovering that the target codenamed AF was Midway Island. Their work gave Admiral Nimitz the chance to set a trap, positioning his carriers for an ambush. It was one of the greatest intelligence coups in history, but for decades it remained a secret. Only in the 1970s did the truth emerge when classified files were finally released. The world learned that Midway was not only a story of courage in the skies, but also of intellect and perseverance in the shadows. But not all reckonings are written in archives. Some are written in guilt, in memory, and silence. McClusky, like many aviators, never celebrated his role. He saw the battle as a duty, something necessary but tragic. When asked years later how it felt to destroy the Japanese carriers, he answered quietly, "It felt like ending something that should never have begun." That was the truth of Midway. Victory and sorrow intertwined. For Japan, too, the reckoning came slowly. After the war, the surviving admirals and engineers studied what had gone wrong. Their conclusions were painful. They had underestimated American resilience. They had divided their fleet. And most fatally, they had believed the United States lacked the will to fight back. Midway proved them wrong. In a post-war report, Admiral Ugaki wrote, "At Midway, we lost not just ships, but direction. After that, We were fighting only against time. It was a quiet confession, an acknowledgement that beneath the pride and propaganda, Japan had realized the truth. The tide of history had turned. For historians, the Battle of Midway became a symbol of balance, of how the smallest decisions can tip the scales of war. If McClusky had turned back 5 minutes earlier, he might never have seen the Japanese fleet. If the Japanese had launched their counterstrike 10 minutes sooner, their decks would have been clear, and the American bombs might have found nothing but empty ocean. 10 minutes. That was the difference between dominance and disaster. In the end, the battle was not just won by strategy, but by timing, endurance, and the fragile hand of chance. That is the reckoning of every war. How history turns on moments no one can ever predict. In 1976, decades after the war, Wade McClusky passed away. He was 70 years old. At his funeral, the Navy honored him as the man who found the enemy when all seemed lost. But his friends remembered something simpler: his humility, his quiet faith, his refusal to call himself a hero. One of his fellow aviators said during the eulogy, "Wade didn't chase glory, he chased duty." And duty found him. In 1997, he was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for Valor, recognition long overdue. By then, most of his generation was gone, but their legacy, written in the skies above Midway, still lived on. Today, historians speak of Midway with reverence. It was not the largest battle, nor the bloodiest, but it was decisive, the point where the Pacific War began to bend toward Allied victory. And yet, behind that triumph lies something deeper, a reckoning with what war truly demands. Every victory comes with a price. Every triumph leaves a shadow, and the men who fight, whether on the deck of a carrier or in the cockpit of a dive bomber, carry that shadow with them long after the world forgets. For them, the reckoning never ends. When the archives finally opened, when the historians wrote their final chapters, one truth remained unchanged. Midway was not about destruction, it was about endurance, about men who refused to surrender and who, by doing so, changed the course of the world. And as time continues its endless march, the echoes of that reckoning still drift across the Pacific, soft as the wind, enduring as memory, eternal as the sea. The sea forgets nothing. It holds the wrecks of ships, the bones of men, and the echoes of engines that once carried nations' hopes. Midway was more than a victory. It was the turning of the tide, the moment when the Pacific, vast and merciless, began to whisper a different story. 4 Japanese carriers burned that day on Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later, Hiryu. Each one was a floating city of men, machines, and memories. When they sank beneath the waves, they took with them the heart of the Imperial Navy's air power and a generation of Japan's finest aviators. For the Japanese, it marked the beginning of retreat, not in spirit, but in strength. For the Americans, it was the first breath of hope after months of fear, loss, and uncertainty. In the calm that followed, there were no cheers aboard the U.S. carriers, only the sound of rescue boats and the smell of oil on water. Men leaned over the railings, watching the smoke fade into the horizon, wondering how many of their friends had vanished beneath it. Some called it revenge for Pearl Harbor. Others called it justice. But for those who flew that day, Betraham, the pilots who watched the sky erupt with fire, it was something else entirely. It was survival. It was chance. It was the thin line between courage and luck. In the years that followed, historians would dissect the battle. the timing, the tactics, the code breakers, and the coincidence that led McClusky's squadron to the enemy fleet. They would map the chaos of those few minutes that reshaped the Pacific War. But none could capture the silence that followed, the silence only the survivors could hear. For every Japanese pilot who perished, there was an American who carried his memory, a strange respect born from shared peril, because in the air at that altitude there was no enemy, only men fighting the machines of their own making. Decades later, when explorers found the wrecks at the bottom of the Pacific, they found them still proud, still defiant, resting on the ocean floor like monuments to the age of steel and fire. The Akagi's hull still bore the red circle of the rising sun. The Enterprise's survivors, gray-haired now, spoke of her name with reverence, as if she were a living soul that had carried them home. The Battle of Midway changed more than the course of war. It changed how nations fought and how they remembered. From that day forward, the aircraft carrier replaced the battleship as the symbol of power, mobility, and reach. It was the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one fought not by armies on land, but by wings over an ocean. But even progress has a cost. Every advancement, every innovation is written in the language of loss. Behind each victory lies a ledger of names, men who never came home, engineers who built machines that became their own tombs. The legacy of Midway isn't just in museums or history books. It's in the lessons whispered in every naval academy. It's in the quiet resolve of those who serve, the understanding that courage isn't loud and sacrifice isn't seen. Time has carried the battle into legend, but legends fade. What remains is the truth, that a handful of pilots guided by instinct and luck changed the direction of a war that once seemed unstoppable. Today, at Midway Atoll, the winds still carry the smell of salt and rain. The seabirds cry over rusting bunkers, and beneath the waves, the ghosts of ships lie silent, their decks covered in coral, their stories intact. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The faint hum of engines, the echo of a dive, the heartbeat of men who never returned. War doesn't vanish. It changes its shape and waits to be rediscovered.